Around 15 years back, IVF was practiced in a completely different way. The female partner used to be given medications for 10-12 days to make her eggs grow up in multiples. Those eggs would be extracted, fertilized with the male partner's sperms, embryos created, and depending on the case, put back in her womb in the same month, 2 to 5 days later. She would be then put on some medications to support the pregnancy, and a test would confirm that she is pregnant or not pregnant around a week or so later. So the entire cycle could be wrapped up in 4 weeks' time. But this particular method had certain drawbacks. What if the lady made multiple eggs in her ovaries? The ovaries become swollen, there would be water that collected in her tummy, even in her lungs, she would have respiratory trouble, and in certain severe cases, even death was possible. So, somebody who's come to get pregnant runs a risk of death. None of us want that, right? So, to avoid this, and especially the risks were higher if the lady got pregnant, so to avoid this, segmentation of IVF was proposed. In this method, the lady would take the injections, make her eggs grow up, the eggs would be extracted, embryos would be created, but that's it. We would then freeze the embryos, wait for the lady to have menses, and in the next or the subsequent cycles, these embryos would be re-thawed and put back in a womb. While it took longer than a standard IVF cycle, sometimes 2-3 months also, it was so much safer. Because even if she ended up with hyperstimulation of her ovaries, the very fact that she was not undergoing an embryo transfer and therefore not getting pregnant prevented severe hyperstimulation in all cases. So, with segmentation of IVF, we were able to achieve safer and a much more tolerable method of IVF, the modern IVF, the segmented IVF. One of the methods by which this was made possible was the ability to freeze embryos. Before segmentation of IVF, embryo freezing was a vexing issue. We froze them by the classical slow freezing method, which was not really the best method. We used to lose embryos, and therefore most of us would want to do fresh transfers to avoid wasting embryos by freezing them. At the same time that segmentation of IVF was being proposed, the process of freezing of embryos was undergoing a total change. Vitrification of embryos was introduced. This was a much better method. The embryos were frozen instantly, and once that was carried out, there was no damage to the embryos because of the process of freezing. And we wanted to use them, you could bring them to life back again with minimal or no damage. So actually the segmentation of IVF was made possible with the invention and implementation of the vitrification process of the embryos. When these two came about, the application of frozen embryo transfer in a standard IVF cycle increased manifold. So much so that today, in most IVF centers, frozen transfers outnumber fresh transfers by a ratio of 2:1. So why is it that more and more clinics are preferring to do frozen embryo transfers these days? Is it because it is actually better, or safer, or does it have higher pregnancy rates? Actually, it's a combination of all three. See, in a standard IVF cycle, we need to grow up multiple follicles and medications have to be given. So now what these medications do is they definitely make multiple eggs grow up. But the body is not used to such high levels of hormones which get generated because of these multiple eggs. With such high levels of hormones in the body, the endometrium does not match up to the follicular growth. It becomes faster, it grows thicker, and therefore it is out of step with the follicular growth. In the same cycle, if the embryos were to be put back, not only she ran the risk of OHSS, she ran the risk of failures as well, because the endometrium was not at its receptive best, because it had been exposed to much higher levels of hormones than what is used to. This is the reason why we feel that a fresh cycle was not really the best method of doing an IVF cycle. Because of the availability of the vitrified embryos and the higher chances of avoiding OHSS, FET became popular also because of the fact that it turned out to be a better alternative. In most instances, after the eggs have been extracted, the hormones come down to normal levels and the lady menstruates and comes back to her normal self in a month or maybe in 2 months. We could then carry out the frozen embryo transfer, hopefully in a natural cycle, where the hormonal milieu is so much more easier and milder for the body. The endometrium is perfectly in sync with the follicular growth, and just by monitoring the rate of growth of the follicle and its probable ovulation time, we can also decide on the time of embryo transfer, and those frozen embryos could be thawed back and put back in a womb. So, in all circumstances, we see that frozen embryo transfer is actually better, safer, and has higher pregnancy rates as well. The only criticism that has been made out for frozen embryo transfer cycles is there is a higher incidence of preeclampsia or pregnancy-induced hypertension in women. Because when a frozen embryo transfer is carried out in an artificial cycle or a HRT cycle, then the corpus luteum, which is essential for the pregnancy to implant in a natural cycle, is absent, and that corpus luteum does not make the hormones which are necessary to keep the blood pressure low. In such women, there could be a reason to avoid frozen embryo transfer, do a fresh transfer, or better still, to carry out a frozen embryo transfer in a natural cycle itself. Overall, it seems that frozen embryo transfer is a better alternative to transfer in the same cycle for most couples, and unless otherwise indicated, it is highly suggested that you consider a frozen embryo transfer rather than a fresh transfer. In best case scenario, the frozen embryo transfer should be carried out in a natural cycle setting alone.